Hello, everybody, and greetings from Stockholm. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person or even in real time, but I guess we're getting used to this new way of doing things. I'm actually walking through the old town here on my way to the university, and when I get there, I'll record the rest of the presentation and I'll talk a little bit about some of the papers that are in the PLoP conference this year and the connections between them and some of the lessons that I think we can draw not only for the PLoP community and the pattern language community, but also for where we are emerging from the pandemic and some of the lessons about how we know and act and how we collaborate together to form decisions to deal with challenges that we're facing, like the pandemic and perhaps many more to come. So I look forward to having a discussion with you about it. So welcome to our office, the Center for the Future of Places at KTH Royal Institute of Technology. It's pretty quiet around here these days thanks to the pandemic, but that's probably just as well. It'll give me a chance to record my presentation without too much interruption. So as I mentioned, I found several very interesting papers in the PLoP submittals this year, and I want to talk about several of those as a way of illuminating some of the themes that are emerging in our movement and the broader world coming out of the pandemic. This one by Takashi Iba is talking about using pattern languages to deal with the current pandemic, which is certainly a relevant topic. But he's not just writing new patterns, he's talking about what he calls a pattern language remix. In this case, he has chosen and translated 58 patterns from 16 different pattern languages of various domains. So in effect, what he's doing is he's arguing that we need more of sort of DNA to be able to reuse for different challenges, not only the pandemic, but other things that may happen that may be similar or may have related features, rather than just writing new patterns that aren't necessarily related to previous challenges or previous genetic material, so to speak, in the pattern language. So I thought that was a very interesting paper highlighting this issue of how we use patterns and pattern languages as part of a more genetic approach, a process of reusing the material that we already have. And in a similar vein, Rebecca Werfs-Brock's paper is questioning whether we should continue to write new patterns. Maybe we should stop and, if you will, digest the patterns that we have already written. And I think that's an important emerging point as well. And she says she believes that change needs to start with pattern writers like her, like us, and that instead of writing ever more and more patterns, we need to focus more on connecting, on relating, on promoting, and refreshing existing impactful patterns. The other thing she notes is that change needs to be made in how our community connects to other communities, presents, organizes, and promotes patterns to the rest of the world. And I'll take up that point a little later because I think it's also a very important one for developing and advancing pattern language methodology. And then finally, I wanted to talk about this paper from Elena Fenedori, which in many ways is the most philosophical paper that I think has been submitted this year. It talks about the nature of patterns and pattern languages, and I think that's a very important discussion to have right now to reassess what is the core contribution of pattern languages in this particular era that we're in. What are we doing here? Why is it valuable? Why should it be valuable to other people? And how do we communicate that to them? I think this goes to the core of where we are at this moment in many ways. So I would encourage you to have a look at this paper, and it's philosophical, as I said, and a little hard maybe to get your head around. She talks about biosemiotics, which is the idea that patterns are rooted in the natural structures of the world, really. They're rooted in our natural biology and our bodies. And they're just expressions that are capturing some of the essential relationships between the structures of the world. That's a point that Chris Alexander made to me once when I talked to him about this. I asked him what he thought was the most distinctive realization looking back on his work with pattern languages. And he said that I thought I was inventing something, but it turns out I think I was discovering something. That is, he was discovering something about the structure of the world and the structure of our ideas in the world and how we use language to map the world and to share our understanding of the world and to actually to interact with the world and to transform the world, and how we find reliable knowledge and actionable knowledge about the world, and how we can move forward on our challenges on that basis in a way that is not too contaminated, if you will, too weakened by the methodology that we're using. We're always limited by the methodology that we're using for knowing the world. But the essence, I think, of pattern language technology is that we're capturing some of the essential relatedness or interrelatedness, the structural characteristics of the structure that we're confronting. And we're capturing that in our knowledge systems. I don't think I need to go through a lot of detail with this audience about how patterns do that, the sort of overlaps and the web network interactions between the different elements of a pattern and between different patterns. But this is a profound aspect of pattern languages, and one that I think we need to get our arms around in this moment of history. So for the next part of the talk, what I'd like to do, rather than dig into these papers further, and I'll just encourage you to have a look at them. I think there is some great material in the PLoP conference this year, and these three papers in particular are very interesting. But what I would like to suggest in the next part of my talk is the nature of the challenges that we face right now, not only the COVID-19 pandemic, but other challenges that are equally daunting in many ways, if not more so in the long run, because of course this is not the first pandemic in human history, and it won't be the last. And it certainly won't be the last challenge that the human species is facing, in part because of our own activities and our own ways of interacting with the world and with each other. So 2020, the year from hell, it would seem, not only with the pandemic and the wildfires, the storms, economic shocks to the system, all of the things that are going on this year that seem to be systemic failures of various kinds that are quite unnerving, I think we would all agree. But the question we have, of course, is that how much are these indicators of broader trends? How much is it the case, as I would argue, that our very technological success has introduced externalities that are now beginning to manifest in the problems that we're seeing and increasingly threatening the sustainability of global systems in all of the ways that we're witnessing? And I would make the case, and I'm not the only one to do so, that we're going to have to make a transition, either on terms that we choose now or terms that maybe come to us in very disagreeable forms, or maybe some combination of the two. If you like, we could think of the challenges ahead as the four horsemen of the apocalypse, so to speak. Not only climate change, which a lot of people are focused on right now, but clearly resource depletion is a critical issue, ecological destruction, pollution and contamination, invasive species, and so on. On that note, there was an interesting article that you might have seen about the giant hogweed, which is taking over in many agricultural areas of Russia. And what's interesting about this is that this is something that was introduced by the state government, the Soviet Union, as a food source for livestock, for cattle. So this was a centralized action that created enormous rebound effects, enormous externality costs that manifested much later, only now. And so we're seeing interaction of all these different systems of economic and political and environmental and technological and so on, producing these kinds of effects. And you might argue also, I would make the case that there's a kind of fifth horseman, the decline of social capital, the decay in the integrity of cultural and knowledge systems. We're all aware of the problems with the internet and social media and so on, the economic failures that are resulting in the rise of populism and other phenomena, conspiracy theories online and so forth. And it's ironic to think back, as many of us in this audience remember the promise of the web back in the 1980s and 1990s, how excited many of us were about the open distributed structure of the internet that can withstand a nuclear attack, so it can surely withstand corporate America. And people in groups are going to have their own sense of community and what we can do. So don't worry about people being anonymous. Life will be happier for the online individual. That's an ironic passage, certainly. And then John Perry Barlow, perhaps the most utopian of them all, talking about the internet as the most liberating tool for humanity ever invented. We will create a civilization of the mind in cyberspace. Well, we all know what happened, which was very different. The sort of internet cesspool, the drowning out of noise, and people who were gaming the system, who were taking advantage of the openness of the internet indeed. And it's not just annoying, it's actually dangerous. When you see, for example, the rise of extremism, the surge in depression and suicides and other serious issues in society, the ability to mount cyber attacks on political systems and so on, and the fraying, I would argue, of our political discourse. None of these things are new, of course, but you could certainly argue that the internet has thrown fuel onto the fire of all of these phenomena and changed the dynamic by which we work together and resolve some of these issues to the extent that we do, made it much more difficult to do that. And going back to John Perry Barlow, it's quite charming to look back now at the idea of forming our own social contract where anyone anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular and so forth. And your legal concepts of property, expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply. Here, there is no matter. Well, there is matter here. There are real bullets and real blood and real human beings, real human lives that are being impacted by these phenomena that are, again, not necessarily created by the internet, but certainly accelerated by the internet and its dynamic. And so we're facing a century of looming challenges, not only the environmental challenges, but the institutional challenges and the challenges of how we know, how we react to the issues that we face, and how we work together to resolve those issues. And if you think about 2020, and then you think about 2040, 2060, 2080, clearly we have reason to be concerned that we need to confront these challenges now. And 2080 is not a far off time. This happens to be my grandson, Jude, who is 4 years old today. I'm 64, which means that he will be my age in the year 2080. So this is certainly brings it home for me as something very real. It's not an abstraction, not a far off time that we're dealing with. And again, it seems that we're going to have to make a fundamental transition, as I said, on terms we choose now or terms that are forced upon us, or maybe some mixture of the two. And I think that transition is going to have to be in our technologies and in the way we use resources, in the way we identify and share knowledge about how to adapt to our challenges. But I want to point out that we have been here before, and that's what I'll talk about in the next section of the talk. In a real sense, you could say that we are creatures of climate change. If you look back at our evolutionary history, there have been a number of events. Perhaps the most profound was about 200,000 years ago, the so-called African mega drought, in which the entire continent became much drier and the human species clustered on the southern edge of Africa on the coast, as we now understand, and was down to a very, very small population, only about 1,000 individuals, as the genetic evidence is showing us, an endangered species by any definition. And what did we do? We innovated. We began to use new technologies, new tools. We began to do things like fishing and gathering with baskets and other kinds of innovations. And that became a defining trait of our species. In comparison to the Neanderthals, for example, we began to become much more innovative with new kinds of spears and tools and hooks and all kinds of other things, artwork and so on. Whereas the Neanderthals pretty much stayed with the same spear technology as we understand it now. And then about 10,000 years ago, there was another major climate change event, a mini ice age known as the Younger Dryas. And we adapted and survived that as well. And we did that by forming new kinds of technologies again, new kinds of agriculture and irrigation, and new kinds of settlements that protected those assets, a new human era of city settlement, which really led to everything that has happened in the 10,000 years since. And so, if you think about the scale of human history and you consider the scale, even for example, of industrial technology of the last 300 years, that pales in comparison to the span of city making, about 10,000 years, and the span of Homo sapiens going back about 250,000 years, about three times the length that I can show on this slide. But you get the idea that this is a really, really small interval of time. Then when you look at their climate models that are only about 80 years or so, and the span of what we now call sustainable buildings, only about 40 years or so, we are in a really small bubble of history, and one that we need to look beyond and learn the lessons of these other eras of human history and other ways of adapting and surviving that we have engaged in the past. So we have always been a technological species, whether it's arrows, axe heads, hooks, needles, baskets, and then language, and then other more sophisticated forms of technology in the more recent centuries of human experience. And I want to suggest that there are a number of lessons that we can draw today, one of which is that this planet is a dangerous place, and there's nothing new about major challenges to human well being. The second point is that we do have the capacity, as we've shown in the past, to adapt, to learn, to survive under these kinds of threats. And we've done it a number of times before, maybe many times before, in fact. And this has involved, in many cases, new technologies and new ways of learning to adapt, sharing with one another in our cultures. And the current situation is unique, perhaps only in that we ourselves have caused the problems, but it's not unique in that the problems are fundamentally structural in nature. And when we look at those problems and we see that the solutions are also potentially structural and in principle available to us if we correctly understand and adapt to the nature of the challenges. And there are many other biological examples, not only in our own human history, where we can learn some lessons. And the nature of the current challenges goes to our ways of using resources, of employing technologies, of using language to manipulate our world, including our cities and towns. And so cities have a lot to do with our human story, both past and present, and something I'm particularly interested in because it's my own disciplinary focus as an urbanist. As my friend Herbert Girardet and his colleague Tier Dilstra pointed out, urban agglomerations and their resource uses are really changing the human presence on Earth, changing our relationship to our ecosystems. And so the cities of the 21st century are really where human destiny is going to be played out and where the future of the biosphere is going to be determined. And so it's important to understand what Jane Jacobs referred to as the kind of problem a city is, how cities evolve, how they change, how we can design intended outcomes to meet new challenges, including the impacts that cities generate and that we generate within cities. And this goes to the whole question of how we act as designers, what design is. And in that respect, I love the great quote by Herbert Simon, who defined design as a process of devising courses of action aimed at changing existing situations into preferred ones. So we're all designers. We're all trying to develop new technologies, new ways of interacting with the world to change existing situations into preferred ones, including existing situations that are perhaps unsustainable or that are threats to our well-being. And so that is the challenge for cities in the future. So, where are we at this moment in history with cities? Well, we're in a period of rapid urbanization that's unprecedented. In the next 30 years, 40 years from 2010, when I made this slide, we will have produced more urban fabric than in all of human history. And this is Beijing in 2000. This is Beijing just 9 years later. The extent of the city has increased fourfold, but the population has not increased fourfold. And what that means is that the density is going down and sprawl is going up. And this is happening in city after city. Here's Nairobi in 1986. Here it is in 2016. Same phenomenon, density going down, sprawl is going up. Here's Las Vegas in 1972. Here it is in 2010. Again, density going down, sprawl going up. But also look at what's happening to Lake Mead, the water level, the rapid depletion of not only Lake Mead, but also the aquifer and other water resources, as well as other forms of resource depletion that are accelerating around the world today. Now, it's not all bad news. There is some good news because it brings people out of poverty and so forth, but there are many alarming aspects, particularly because of the nature of urbanization right now, this fragmented, high consumption form of urbanization that creates many externalities that are not well accounted for and certainly not well managed. And it's really coming in two different forms. One is the explosive growth of informal settlements, slums, and so on, and the other is the market rate urbanization. As you see here, the proliferation of sprawling, resource intensive, and high emissions urban forms around the globe. And in both cases, it's failing to fully provide what cities can for human beings, the ability to connect with people, to connect with resources, and to use those resources in a most efficient way to create prosperity and well being. The physical system of the city needs to connect us as agents that are interacting, and we can use all the other forms of technology, the data networks, the transportation, and so on. But the foundation is really what cities are. And this is why public space is such a critical platform for everything else that happens, the proximities, the interactions, the happenstance, propinquity and serendipity and diversity and new ideas from new people and so forth. And so this is something that I think the research is showing in a profound way, that public space is a kind of natural foundation of urban connectivity, if you will. And this is something that is being echoed in many fields of network science today, how systems of connections function and transform, how they can self-organize, how they can produce new catalytic interactions and quite efficient interactions in many cases. And in the case of cities, that's the urban networks that are built on public spaces. And again, this echoes our friend Chris Alexander, the idea of a network of interconnecting elements in a city or in any other system, and the way those elements have web-like connections, overlaps, and sometimes strong forces between groups of them and weaker forces between others, and so forth. And we can identify those as patterns. And we indeed can describe those through language, as I'm doing right now, or as we always do when we're describing something salient in the environment and pointing out a cluster of relationships by doing so. And so the idea that we can map these web networks, these interactions, and we can then manipulate them more easily through more sort of transformative interactions that we desire, following Herbert Simon, is a very important idea, I think, and an idea that I think we in the pattern language community need to hold at the core of what we do and why it's important. And in my field of urbanism, you can see, as my colleague Luis Betancourt has pointed out, that well-connected cities are not just a matter of fairness and justice, they're also good for everybody's bottom line, because fragmented cities where certain populations are isolated not only require policing and social services and other drains on the resources of the entire city, but they don't produce as well. They don't follow Metcalfe's law, where the more nodes you have interconnected, the more prosperity, the more benefits you get from the whole system. And that's a very important insight as well, I think. This is one of the reasons also that, as my own research has shown, cities can be so much greener than suburban sprawl and other places, because they do allow people to come together in a more natural form and interact and create social ties, create economic ties, create wealth, ultimately, social and economic wealth. And so public space seems to help to fuel a natural dynamic of resource conservation and even regeneration versus the idea of depletion as a way of generating economic wealth and at the cost of many externalities. And we can see that, for example, in 2008, where sprawl produced not only emissions and other environmental impacts, but also economic impacts. The mortgage meltdown occurred primarily in the sprawling drive till you qualify suburbs that created the cascade of financial failures and near financial collapse globally. So we need to understand the kind of problem a city is, as Jane Jacobs put it. We need to understand how these externalities can be identified and mapped and managed and so on. And that's really the work that we're doing at the center here in Stockholm, researching urbanization and the key role of public space within it and how we understand that, how we manage that. We've been working with UN Habitat in recent years, developing the language for the new urban agenda on public space, and that is now adopted by acclamation by all 193 member countries, which is a very important milestone. But of course, it begs the question of how this is all going to be implemented, and that's the next key phase. But it does show that the understanding of how cities work and how public spaces work is evolving in a very hopeful way, I think. And the great Jane Jacobs, who I mentioned before, has really foreshadowed a lot of this in her masterpiece, The Death and Life of Great American Cities, where she talked about how different parts of cities function and sometimes in a sort of idiotic way without feedback regulation. And she says what we need to do is to replace feedback that has been left out, the feedback to externalities, and get that reintegrated into our urban systems. And she asks, how do we make up for this omission? A very, very important question, I would say. And I'll give you a quick example of why this question of feedback and externality feedback is so important before I go on to the next section of the talk, talking about how we actually might create tools to do that. On the left, you might think of a tomato that you buy at the grocery store. It was grown with fossil fuel fertilizers, pesticides, water pumped out from the aquifer, refrigerated and shipped, and so on. On the right is a tomato that's grown with compost and rainwater, not refrigerated, not transported, and so on. Now, this is a very simplistic example, of course, but you get the idea that the tomato on the left has high hidden externalities, on the tomato on the right has low hidden externalities. And what's the difference that we see as consumers? Well, the one on the left is probably quite a bit cheaper, actually. And the reason it's cheaper is that we are being subsidized by those externalities that are being charged to the system, charged to our grandkids, so to speak. And we are, in effect, participating in a massive transfer of wealth from the future to the present, and thereby destroying that wealth, the absolute opposite of what sustainability is supposed to be. So how do we get from a depletion economics that's mining the future to a kind of repletion economics that's prosperous in the present and even more prosperous in the future? And one thing that seems essential is, again, that we need to identify these externality costs. We need to learn to value those. We need to identify them. We need to create models and scenario modeling tools that can help us to identify how these will be occurring over time. And then we can begin to integrate them into our economic systems, our economic feedback. So we need technological tools that can model these phenomena and their interactions and do that as whole systems, not as linear or waterfall systems, not as a sort of whack-a-mole phenomenon. And this is, of course, where Agile has been invented and many other related ideas, including the ideas of pattern languages. And this is what I'll suggest to you in the next section of the talk, that pattern languages can be very useful systems design tools for exactly these kinds of challenges. So I'm sure this sounds quite abstract, but let me give you a more concrete example from my own research. This is my PhD dissertation where I used pattern languages as part of a methodology to model the externalities, in this case of greenhouse gas emissions related to urban form. And you could model other externalities, of course, but I picked that one because it's certainly a critical one, and it's a very informative one in many ways. It's the ultimate sort of systems problem. We know that urban form has a strong correlation with greenhouse gas emissions. And in fact, when you compare different urban regions and different urban morphologies, it's quite striking. In the United States, for example, the difference between city areas and suburban and rural areas is about a threefold increase in the rural and suburban areas. Between Sweden and the United States is about a threefold increase. Between Stockholm and Sweden, there's about a doubling. And between Stockholm and the average US settlement is about a six-fold increase, which really cannot be accounted for except in large measure through the impacts of urban form. And we know, for example, that urban density is strongly correlated with emissions per capita from things like transportation and other urban sources as well. And that's pretty self-evident when you think about things being closer together, right? And requiring less energy to move around and use resources and so on. And that makes sense. And you'll see, in fact, in the research, the very strong correlation here in the Bay Area. There's an inverse correlation between density, represented here by the red in San Francisco, and lower emissions, represented by green in this map. And then you see the low density in the East Bay and high emissions. So once again, an inverse relationship between those two. But it's not just density, as the research showed, but other factors of urban morphology that affect emissions. And we have to tease those out and understand how they interact as part of a system. And indeed, you'll see in the higher density, low emissions areas of San Francisco, mixed use, walkability, multimodal forms of transportation, compact housing, and so forth. And in the East Bay, you'll see a much different urban morphology, much lower density, more fragmented, things spread out, functionally segregated uses, one single driving mode, really non-walkable, and large housing typologies, and so on. And we have to recognize also that these environments create a kind of choice architecture that influences our behavioral decisions. We're not going to walk in the environment on the left in San Antonio or ride our bikes. We would be crazy to. But in the environment on the right in Amsterdam, we might walk or bike and stop off at a little grocery store and live a very different lifestyle with very different consumption patterns. And so my challenge was to develop a modeling tool for all of these different morphologies and their influences to be able to predict with reasonable accuracy how different urban forms might translate into greenhouse gas emissions per capita. And so I won't spend a lot of time going into the details, but I looked at many different modeling methodologies and the idea of modeling systems, not just linear phenomena, and things like neural networks and Bayesian methodology and many other very interesting things. It was one of the most fascinating parts of my research. But also pattern languages fit right into that discussion, the idea that you can model these interactions and in an important way capture some of their dynamics. And that was something that I worked closely with our friend Ward Cunningham on, trying to understand how not only pattern languages, but wikis and other kinds of tools were able to do this. Ward and I, you may remember, wrote this paper for PLoP in 2013, noting that wiki is not only an outgrowth of pattern languages, in some ways a wiki is a kind of proto-pattern with the same kind of structure and the same kind of dynamic interrelation and the ability to evolve and change and improve over time. And that was something that we looked at closely. I looked at closely in my research. So the model that I produced as a result of all of this research was something called WikiPLACE, which is an acronym for Pattern Language Adaptive Calculator of Externalities. So in other words, we're going to model these externalities. We're going to be able to calculate them in an adaptive way, in a way that improves over time. And so let me go back to this example. We were talking about earlier, the dumb and dumber version of the internet, right? And all the stupid things you'll click on, number 3 will shock you and so forth. How does that compare to this example, which doesn't get dumber and dumber? It seems to get smarter and smarter, at least more useful and more reliable. Well, I would suggest to you that the difference is a process that proceeds iteratively and improves incrementally, that produces more reliable, more shareable knowledge about the world, sufficient for shared action and for adaptation, for intelligence, And that's a process of curation. We could also relate it to Bayesian methodology. We could relate it to the way science works, the way traditions work, the way language works ultimately. And this is something that I think we need to get our arms around, particularly in this era of political dumbing down, the sort of simplistic left-right dualities of command and control versus let her rip. And we need to see that there's something beyond this simplistic duality, this idea of a curated culture, if you will, with subsidiarity, with polycentric governance, and that there are technologies that we need to evolve towards in order to do that. My old philosophy professor, Robert Kane, pointed out the folly of this simplistic left-right duality, and he noted that there are at least 4 different axes of political ideas, if not more, and that the actual mix is quite complex, as he shows. And not only is there that sort of simplistic dumbing down, there's also the drowning in noise. Too much information equals no information. If you can't tease out the signal from the noise, information is selection and it is curation. So we have many problems of knowledge today, but we also have solutions, ways forward in these Bayesian methodologies, iterative refinement, evidence-based and incrementally improvable modeling. That was the thesis of my dissertation, and I think it's something that I demonstrated. In the next section, I'll go through WikiPLACE, a wiki-based tool that can actually model these externalities. Now, I think many of you know about Ward Cunningham's new federated wiki tool. And the idea of that is it's a new generation of wiki that is able to do all kinds of interesting things, including numeric calculations and other exciting frontier ideas. This is an example that he made for Nike. It's a scenario modeling tool that allows the calculations of externalities in shoe design, so that a designer could use this as a way of assessing the different choices for materials and suppliers and so on, and generate a performance chart based upon the selections that they've made. And we did something similar. I did in my PhD, and Ward was a huge help there as well, using the morphology elements of my research to generate a wiki tool to do a scenario modeling tool there as well. And for example, to take some of the pattern, in this case from the original pattern language book, and use those to identify the different morphological features and how they contribute to greenhouse gas emissions. And we were able to take those patterns and actually generate predictive calculations based upon the research, so that we could model how those different components contributed and interacted and so on. And here, for example, is density rings, the idea of density, mix of uses, web of shopping and activities, multimodal transportation, web of transportation, and so on. And here's what the wiki tool looks like in a single page. And you can see that the different components can be calculated. You can change the variables and you can produce different scenarios based upon the results. And so for my dissertation, I ran several tests of the model against known outcomes in 3 different cases: country to city, and neighborhood to neighborhood. And I used actual greenhouse gas data to compare. And we got pretty good results, as you can see, quite reliable, within about 5 to 20% accuracy or so, which is pretty darn good under the circumstances. And again, this is just a first iteration. Again, based on what Jane Jacobs tells us, we need to develop these scenario modeling tools, these feedback tools that allow us to make up for this great omission in our, if you will, our depletion economies today, in order to rewire our systems to produce a repletion economy, which is very much what we need in the future. So I think there are many important lessons emerging from this COVID era, the post-COVID era, if you will, and many opportunities, I think, for those of us who are working with patterns and pattern languages to get engaged. I've given you a brief and perhaps absurdly brief overview of what I see as some of the issues and some of the work that's been done. And I'll mention one of the more recent projects, which many of you know. This is a new pattern language for growing regions, and it's a partnership with UN Habitat, essentially to write patterns for the implementation of the new urban agenda, which I mentioned earlier. And you'll notice that the patterns in the book follow pretty much the classic format of the pattern language, the original print pattern language. But there's also an online version which I would encourage you to explore. And you just enter that URL. It's very easy to do, and love to get your feedback on it, your ideas, and get a chance to play with it. It's read only at present, but we hope that it will be fully editable and fully shareable in the near future. So I look forward to having a good discussion with you about this right now and continuing into the future. Thanks.